I'll explain the context before we do the poem. In order to win over the people to his side, Absalom sets out to make public demonstrations. The poem describes his appeal to the people, the organization of his progress through the country, and also the consolidation of the opposition party. Absalom concludes his speech to the people on an emotional note. Offering his tears, he expresses his wish. See, read the lines. And it is my wish the next successor's reign may make no other Israelite complain. That is, he expresses the wish that the next successor's reign should give no reason to Israel to complain. From line 721 onwards. Youth, beauty, graceful action seldom fail, but common interest always will prevail, and pity never ceases to be shown to him who makes the people's wrongs his own. So Absalom has succeeded in winning over the people of Israel with his youth, beauty, and charm. He eagerly plunges into dire campaigning. His swift progress is described very well in this stanza, and it gives the impression that it was all pomp and intended to disguise the real intentions. He travelled through the length and breadth of the land, displaying his glories and garnering the support of the masses, and they received him with open arms and blessed him as their young Messiah. So the Duke of Monmouth, he demonstrates his victories throughout the world, and like the sun, he is now surveying the land of which he hopes to become the next king. Dryden says that Absalom's fame reached the place even before he actually got there, and wherever he went, whichever house he went, he was received, welcomed with shouts of joy. They welcomed him as if he were a guardian angel. But among the supporters or among the admirers of the young Absalom, Dryden makes a special mention of one particular character called Issachar. He is a Protestant squire, and real life he represents a Tom Thine. And he was a person who had to bear the huge financial burden of entertaining Absalom. So all this while, when the procession was going on, Achitophel was busy contriving, and he was trying to gauge the people's attitude towards Absalom. Even as he strove to manifest the strength and competence of Absalom, Achitophel was shrewd enough to distinguish friends from foe, and he also wanted to ascertain their strength before the final confrontation. So this was the real motive behind the procession. But all these ulterior motives were very carefully hidden under a mask of love and loyalty towards the prince. They made very good use of religion and redressal of grievance as powerful weapons to cheat the people. The people were led to believe that the king's life was in danger, and that his worst enemies were none other than his own brother and his wife. Now, what follows next is actually a record of the king's views as expressed by Dryden. Actually, Dryden is acting as his mouthpiece in this poem, trying to express what the king wants to tell the people. The people of Israel, that is the people of England, they are warned not to fall for the bait. So if you fall for this, then it will be equivalent to exchanging a state of good health for some disease. And they should not do that. They should not succumb to the guile and schemes of Achitophel. So the people would be fools. In fact, they are being fools by imagining themselves as having or as suffering from some disease when they are actually enjoying the best state of health. So they are just unnecessarily imagining some troubles that might happen to them in future, and just spoiling their present peace of mind. So they don't really have to worry about, trying to find the successor to the monarch and also issue any ordinance on behalf of God. Dryden says that kingship is based on an agreement between the king and the people. What shall we think? Can people give away both for themselves and sons? Sons is used in the sense of the future generations, their native sway. That is this agreement, or it's some kind of a law or a contract between the people and the king. So it is as per that agreement that the people have decided to give king the authority, the scepter. See, if those who gave the scepter is the symbol of power or authority. So it is by virtue of those laws that we are able to enjoy our rights. So, and if those laws are vain by which we right enjoy, if kings unquestioned can those laws destroy. So these laws are binding on everybody, on the king, on the people also. So if the king cannot be questioned, or if the king is going to destroy the laws, what will happen? So nobody has the right to tamper with the laws or that agreement or that contract. So the contract is essentially between the king and the people, but nobody, and it is equally binding on the king as well as the people. So nobody has the right to destroy them, not the king, not the people. So everybody has to abide by that law. And it is as per that contract that the people have decided to give him to give the king the scepter or that authority to rule. So if people cannot be trusted to take control of everything, and kings are not just, they cannot be treated like officers. They have been given that power and authority by the people. So it is there in the agreement. So monarchy is some kind of an agreement. So everybody has to abide by the rules. And if the people are going to take control of everything, if they are going to decide, okay, who is going to rule us or who is going to be the next successor. So they cannot be the judge of it and just. And you cannot reduce the king to the position of a mere officer. So everything was decided. This was decided at the time of handing over that scepter. So, and this is binding on everyone. That agreement or that contract, it has to be obeyed by everyone. Nobody has the right to change or destroy the laws. So to explain this better, Dryden makes use of an analogy from the Bible. He is talking about the disobedience of Adam. So that because he disobeyed God, because Adam and Eve, they disobeyed God, they were punished. And then that punishment, it binds the heirs of Adam and Eve, all their coming generations of mankind. So that became the original sin for which the subsequent generations of mankind, they are still paying for that original sin. So the same way it has to be binding on the contract, the same, just as Adam's original sin, or the future generations also had to bear the brunt or the consequences of the original sin. In the same way, this contract, it will be binding on the people and also the subsequent generations. Or how could heavenly justice damn us all, who never consented to our father's fall? Referring to Adam's original sin, Dryden says that how could heavenly justice damn us all? That is, we have consent, means we have accepted our fate. We know that we have to suffer for that original sin. So that has been accepted. We have accepted divine justice. We have accepted this as part of divine justice. The same way the people should also accept that agreement, the rules of the contract between the king and the people. So if we do not abide by that contract, then the kings would become slaves to those whom they command. So we have given the king, it is as per that agreement that the king has been given the authority to rule us. So if we do not abide by that contract, then what will happen? We have given him that power. We have given the king the authority, isn't it? So if we are not, and that authority has been given as per that contract. So if we reject that, the king would become a mere slave to those whom they command and tenants to their people's pleasures. And so the king cannot be expected to do that. He has been given that ultimate power, and people do not have the right to take it back. People should abide by the rules of the contract. So it is very important for the people to accept that power, because if we are going to reject that, then our own lives, who is there to protect our interests? And he argues that the power of the crowd is people, and the people cannot be given the power to overrule the rights of hereditary kinship, because if that is going to happen, then we also have private property, isn't it? Who will protect our private property? So this position, the position of kingship, has to be guarded, because if that is not guarded, then what protection is there for our own personal property or belongings? So how can you be sure of owning anything else? So this can also go. If the king is not able to hold on to his power or authority, the same thing can happen to us also. People can, anybody can come and forcibly take away whatever we possess. So in order to protect our rights, in order to protect our property, our interest, you need to give that authority to the king. You cannot take it away from him, because if you are going to take away that power from king, then that means that there is no protection for even our own personal belongings. Nobody will be there to protect us. So everything would be, and people and authority means it has to be vested in one person, or it cannot be divided among the people. So a group of people cannot be trusted to be correct in their judgment. So majority of people, they can make mistakes, and there are very few but even kings, he's not saying that kings are entirely faultless or perfect, or perfect in every respect, but the kings can also be accused of faults like oppression and tyranny. But it is very important to have somebody at the head to rule over us and also to protect us. What standard is there in a fickle route, which flowing to the mark runs faster out? He says that you cannot expect great standards of good behavior from the common people, who have exhausted themselves. Now forget about common people, but even parliament. Here he refers, the Sanhedrin is the supreme council of the Jewish people. So even the parliament or the Sanhedrins can contract the lunacy of the public, and they can endanger the security of the country. So you cannot give power or authority to the common people. This will only end in a grave civil war. To murder monarchs for and share the madness of rebellious times, to murder monarchs for imagined crimes. If they may give and take whenever they please, not kings alone, the Godhead's images, but government itself at length must fall to nature's state, where all have a right to all. So in a place where everybody has the right, such a situation is detrimental to the security of the nation. So if they are going to take law in their own hands, if they're going to, the people are going to control everything, if they decide that, okay, we do not have a good king, and you imagine that the imagined crimes of the king may not have done anything, he may not have done anything wrong, but then you just imagine that your king has done something wrong, and that you have to remove the king. Now these lines actually remind one of the murder of Charles I, and also the possibility of removing Charles II for imagined crimes, the crimes that he has not actually done. So Dryden feels that the maintenance of tradition is very important. In fact, it is the only chance of saving the land from worse things to happen. People cannot be trusted to to take control of everything. If they're going to have that, if they're going to feel that they have the power to make their rulers, and then they would shake the foundation. They would, go ahead and even shake the foundation of lawful settled government. And if they do that, they might be doing that with the best of intentions. They might think that they would be able to improve their lot, but ultimately what will happen is they will suffer more. Minor mistakes that they make will lead to major disturbances, and a political revolution at this point will prove a fatal blow to the security of the country. If ancient fabrics nod and threat to fall, to patch the flaws and buttress of the wall, thus far it is duty, but here fix the mark, for all beyond it is to touch our ark. He says that it is always better to maintain tradition and not tamper with it. And Dryden clarifies this point further by referring to the story of Uzzah in the biblical character who appears in the book of Samuel. Just as Uzzah was, Uzzah is an Israelite, and his death is associated with the touching of the holy chest. So just as Uzzah was struck down by God for his impiety in touching the ark or the holy chest, any attempt to reform the government has to be limited to just patching up the flaws. Don't make any major changes. If there are any minor flaws, okay, just patch it up. But other than that, never venture beyond that. If you are going to change it completely, if you are going to change tradition, then the consequences would be terrible. So you can only make minor modifications or minor repair works can be done, but nothing beyond that. But all cure beyond that must be left to God. It is for God, or here probably it is the king who has the power or the authority to do anything beyond that. So Dryden, he brings in the image of God King, and it is the duty of the people to support their divinely anointed king, who alone can preserve the health of the state and also safeguard the property and also the liberty of the individual. And Dryden then proceeds to heap praises on the king and also his supporters. The king, by the by, had just a few friends, and his supporters were very few in number. And there were people who dared to be on the king's side, became enemies of the people. The people suddenly started looking upon them, the supporters of the king, as their enemies. Dryden wants to name a few of the king's supporters, and he says that naming them would be equivalent to praising. And among the supporters of the king, the first name that appears in the list is that of Barzillai. He is the Duke of Ormond. So this is Barzillai is actually a biblical character who lived beyond the Jordan River, and he had sustained King David during Absalom's rebellion. So in this poem, Barzillai represents the Duke of Ormond. He was a patron of Dryden, and he was also a devoted servant of Charles II. In fact, he had followed the king during his exile and served him very faithfully even in times of trouble. So among Ormond's friends, he mentions the names he mentions the fighting warrior who is the Earl of Mulgrave, and also the recording muse who is none other than Dryden himself. So Dryden also sings a eulogy for the Earl of Ossory, who is the late son of Ormond. He says that Ormond has had a lot of children, and he can be praised for begetting many children, but more than half of them were already dead. But this particular person he wants to mention in the poem the eldest son, the son of the Duke of Ormond, that is Thomas, or the Earl of Ossory. Even though this is a digression, Dryden includes Ossory in the list. Ossory is the eldest son of the Duke of Ormond. He includes Ossory because Ossory was highly regarded even by the Whigs, not just the Tories alone. Dryden elaborates on the virtues of the Earl, who had been a loyal and active supporter of the king. Ossory is praised as someone who was unmatched by anyone on land or on sea. But his life on earth was cut short by the heavens, as Israel was unworthy of his birth. Dryden then proceeds to reflect on the pious leaders of the church, the learned leaders of the colleges, and also the judicious leaders of the law, all of whom supported the king. So what follows next is a list of all the supporters, the major supporters of King Charles. So at this point, Dryden stops and says that he would no more sing praises of the Earl. He says that he cannot write anymore. He cannot sing the praises of the Earl anymore. And the inspiration, he has lost all inspiration. He had been flying with the soul of the Earl of Ossory. And now finally, he decides to bid farewell to the noble Earl, and he wants to come back to, the poet wants to come back to earth and find if there is anybody else who can equal him. And then he realizes that no person on earth can be as noble as the Earl. And so now he turns to the next person. So as I mentioned earlier, what follows next is a list of the supporters of the monarch, and the person, the name that appears after the Earl of Ossory is Zadok. Zadok is the Archbishop Sancroft of Canterbury. He then mentions the Sagan of Jerusalem, who is the Bishop of London, Henry Compton. Then Bishop John Dolben of Rochester. He is described as him of the Western Dome. That refers to his position as the Dean of Westminster. In fact, this gave the inclusion of these lines gave Dryden an opportunity to compliment his old school. In fact, the scholars of Westminster, they were sincerely devoted to the king because they depended a lot on the patronage of kings. Then he speaks about the train of loyal peers. It is the judges of England. That includes Adriel. Adriel is John Sheffield, the Earl of Mulgrave. He is described as the Muse's friend because he happened to be a friend of Dryden. The Muse's friend, himself a muse. That is, he was Dryden's friend and he was also a poet himself. He was an ardent supporter of the king and supported him during parliamentary discussions, for which he was rewarded. He was honored with 2 titles. He got the Lord Lieutenancy of the East Riding after the Duke of Monmouth, the disobedient son of Charles, was taken away from the position, and that title was given to Adriel. Next, Jotham is George Savile, the Marquis of Halifax. He's a Prime Minister of Charles, and his speech, it was a very effective speech, and his speech was actually influential in the defeat of the Exclusion Bill. I hope you remember the Exclusion Bill, which was introduced by Shaftesbury in order to exclude James from assuming the throne of England. And Dryden says that George Savile, that is the Marquis of Halifax, he was such a good orator that he could keep huge assemblies spellbound by his oratorial abilities. And for a very short time, he had actually supported the opposite side. And that is because he wanted to oppose the project of debarring the Duke of York from succession. But later on, he switched sides and got reconciled with the king again. Continuing his praise of Jotham or George Savile, the Marquis of Halifax, Dryden says that he had fought single-handedly against Shaftesbury or the Exclusion Bill, and that shows it was a fight of a single person, and that shows how significant the support of that single man was. The next person mentioned in the list is Lawrence of Hyde, who is the Earl of Rochester. He was a very loyal friend of the king, and he stood by the king even in his difficult days. And he was an excellent diplomat, and he was able to conduct negotiations with foreign powers. And he was also the Lord of Treasury. He was very efficient in his position as a Lord of Treasury, and he could manage the financial affairs of the country with great economy. And at the same time, he also made sure that the king did not experience any kind of lack as far as the finances were concerned. Dryden next goes on to introduce another supporter of the king, that is Amiel. Amiel is Sir Edward Seymour, who was the Speaker of the House of Commons for 5 years, from almost 6 years, from 1673 to 1679. And as a speaker, he was extremely skillful, and he always defended the monarch. And he truly represented the spirit of the whole nation. So just as the House of Commons was the true representative of the country, Amiel was the true representative of the House. Dryden goes on to say that the position which was occupied by Amiel was now taken by people who did not possess any of his qualities. When compared, they were all very rash and inefficient people, and they did not possess any of the ability or skill that Amiel possessed. And he compares the successors of Amiel to Phaeton. Phaeton is the son of Helios, the sun god, and he could not. He became a charioteer, but then he was not able to control his father's horses, and he created havoc with seasons. And Dryden is comparing the successors of Amiel to Phaeton, in the sense that the successors could not control the parliament the way Amiel could. And this is because Amiel is Lord Seymour. This is because he took a break, and then he was enjoying his Sabbath, or after taking this break, he was smiling at the stupidity of his, or the inefficiency of his followers, but fully enjoying break from his work, from his toil. He then mentions the chiefs. They were very small in number, but at the same time they remained extremely faithful to the monarch. In fact, they were strong enough or courageous enough to stand up for the king, to support the king against the collective rage of the mob of England. So these people, they were bent upon toppling down the lawful government of the king. And in this situation, in fact, these people, they were the enemies of the king, and they tried to concoct the the popish plot in order to convince the people of England that the king's life was in danger and that there was a plot against the king's life. They went to the extent of producing fake witnesses, hired witnesses, in order to prove the reality of the popish plot. And these witnesses were hired by paying heavy bribes. The king continued to command the respect and loyalty of the few Tories who dared to stand by him even at the expense of popular hatred. So these supporters, they implored the king to stand firm, and they also showed him the wounds or troubles that confronted him. Ambitious to assume the throne, Absalom turned the people against their king. And he also had the support of Achitophel, the evil Shaftesbury. So with Shaftesbury conniving to ruin both the church and the state, the situation was now perfect for a conflict between the two sides. At this point, so all this while, we never got to hear the voice of the king. But now, the king begins to speak, and he speaks with a heart oppressed by the burden of injuries sustained. So what follows is the king's speech, which forms the last section of the poem. And in between, Dryden also mentions the Sheriff of London under the name Shimei. He had taught the people of London the art of cursing their king. Now, speaking about King David, Dryden says that he was inspired by God. It is inspired by God that the divine David spoke from the royal throne. And the followers who listened, and they listened to the speech as if they would listen to the voice of God. They heard the voice of God when the king spoke. The king begins his speech by saying that till now he had been kind and merciful to his subjects. He is referring to the commutation of the punishment of the Earl of Danby and Lord Stafford. But this decision, or the king's power to commute the punishment, was questioned by the Whigs. So now the king says that the Whigs seem to have mistaken his kindness for fear. They have forgotten that it is the very purpose of monarchy to rule and maintain order in the land. The king has finally decided that it was time to show that power was still vested with the monarch and that he was capable of dealing well with errant subjects. He reasserts that monarchy is a sturdy pillar that can hold the burden of the state with ease. He says that all these, the burdens, it might be a burden for a camel, but for a king it is not a burden. He has the power and the strength to bear all that. The king refers to Absalom as the young Samson. That is, any attempt by Absalom or by Monmouth to bring down the pillar of monarchy will result in his own death, destruction. And the reason why he is being compared to young Samson is because Samson is a biblical character. He is a biblical Hercules with a lot of strength. And Samson's death happened when he tried to push the pillars of the temple of the Philistines. So here the pillars refer to monarchy. So any attempt Monmouth makes, to bring down the pillar of monarchy will result in his death. But then as a parent, the king, he admits that he will always be willing to forgive. But it cannot be denied that destiny never intended Absalom or Monmouth to wear the crown. And contrary to what people believed, the king says that Absalom was a fool. He was not a patriot. He just got misguided by Achitophel, or the Earl of Shaftesbury. He's asking, how is it possible that the cause of religion and of the observance of law, misguided by Achitophel or the Earl of Shaftesbury, Monmouth and his supporters have been trying to impose an heir upon the throne of England. They're trying to do it by force. And the Sanhedrins or the Parliament, they should realize that they do not have the authority to do that. They can give away something, only if it belongs to them. And the monarch's consent is also important. The Parliament cannot decide everything. You need the consent of the king also, because the king is also an important part of the government. So if people are going to have the power, if they can decide, okay, who is going to be our king or who is going to be the successor, if they are going to be given that power, then they will use that power to depose the king as well. So that cannot be permitted. And they, it might appear as if they are trying to petition me or a request in a very humble or respectful manner. But what they are actually doing is they are using force. They are making me do it forcibly and not by requesting me to do it. And he compares this behavior of the parliamentarians, this misconduct, to that of Jacob. Jacob again is another biblical character, and he was prompted by his mother. He has a twin brother, Esau, and he, as asked by his mother, he used goat skin on his hands to deceive his blind father, Isaac. So this he uses that analogy from the Bible to compare the attitude or the misconduct of the parliamentarians. They're trying to deceive the king. And what surprises the king is the fact that his own people, his subjects, they believe that they are that they are noble and religious, and they're trying, and that they are praying for the safety of the king, and that they want to they want the security of the country. But all the while, what they have actually been doing is they are trying to take away the power, or they're trying to topple and bring down the pillars of monarchy. And David, he prays to be safeguarded from such plots and treason. He realizes that it is important to guard himself, to protect the powers that he still, the few powers that he still has with him. The king says that he would rule the land as per the law. He would follow the law, and will also make sure that the rebels are also made to follow the law. That is, he proposes to use the law to put down the rebelling factions. He would no longer permit the rebels to usurp royal power or remove ministers from office. So they demand law, but then they are not content with royal mercy. The king has been very kind and patient so far, but then they have mistaken his merciful nature for weakness. So because since the Whigs demand law, and they are not satisfied with the king's merciful nature. In fact, mercy and grace are the best parts of law, but they're not. The parliament is not happy with that. They're not satisfied with that. So since they do not want that, the king says that if you're not happy with, if you're not content, if you're not satisfied with my merciful character, or with the kind nature of law, then you will suffer the utmost rigor or severity of law. It is the best part of law is its merciful nature and grace. So if you're not happy with that, you will see the real face of law. The king is confident that the very people who supported the rebellious factions would turn against them and become witnesses to bring them to execution. What he suggests, what he suggests in his speech is that the false witnesses will turn against the Whigs, and he makes a comparison. What he is trying to say is that the rebels will be destroyed by their own cunning devices, and their supporters will be the witnesses. And he compares the witnesses to the young ones of poisonous snakes, who tear themselves from their mother's womb and feed on the blood which was the source of their life before. He is actually referring to, and there is also an allusion to Belial and Beelzebub to suggest the division among the Whigs. He says that he wouldn't care if they keep fighting, let them fight. And then finally, once their energy is totally exhausted, he would pounce on them with redoubled energy. And then finally, it will be proved that the law is above everything else, and ultimately justice will prevail. The royal speech thus ends with a peal of thunder, which is the stock epic ornament signifying approval and the nod of heaven. Once again, the godlike Charles is restored to the throne of England, and he is accepted as the lawful lord by all willing nations. This dramatic monologue by David himself is based substantially on the work His Majesty's Declaration to all his loving subjects. The political thesis of the poem has been stated as a calm and reasonable reply to the seductive arguments of Achitophel.